So this is our 6th week of the year, and we've been looking at the Magician card, the first letter by Valentin Tomberg in his book, The Meditations on the Tarot. Now, Tomberg, if you don't know, was a student of Rudolf Steiner's wife. He was a Martinist, which is why he addresses each letter to Dear Unknown Friend. And also, he was a Roman Catholic convert later on in life, which massively influenced the writing of this book, of course. It's one of the reasons that it was so much embraced by contemplative mystics like Thomas Keating and all the Thomases. There's Thomas Mann and a bunch of these Benedictine and Trappist monks that are all quite closely connected these days, and so far in my lifetime in the States, in the development of or redevelopment of the contemplative tradition in the Roman Catholic Church and mainstream Christianity. It filtered over quite heavily into the rest of mainstream Christianity, such as in, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, and they really embraced Tomberg's book when it was released, along with, of course, Cardinal Hans Urs von Balthasar, who was a very interesting cardinal. He was very much the polar opposite to Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who, of course, took over the Holy Inquisition and renamed it the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I used to have a beer stein that said Cardinal Ratzinger Fan Club on it that my friends gave me as a joke. Underneath in red, it said, "Putting the smack down on heresy since 1981. They thought it was funny because I was born that year, and that was the year that Ratzinger renamed the Inquisition to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. But just down the road from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, you could find a different congregation run by Cardinal Hans Urs von Balthasar. And his was, I can't quite remember the name, but it basically kind of like interfaith dialogue. So if you went to von Balthasar's congregation within the Vatican, they would say, Jesus is the one light, and that light illuminates all, and therefore we're all part of the same spirit and have the same salvation. Very Vatican II theology. Of course, then if you went across the street to Ratzinger's little congregation and fan club, you had quite a different theology being espoused, and which is why, to this day, it's somewhat fair to say that in a way that Roman Catholicism is still one of the greatest polytheisms we have ever had. And I've always found that an amusing anecdote and somewhat true. Not if you dig down too deep into it theologically, but on the surface, it's got a delightful bit of truthiness to it. So what is an Arcanum for Tomberg? The tarot, the major arcana are very powerful symbols, not just because there's so many different images in them, but because they represent deep spiritual ideas and deep spiritual truths that have emerged over time from its origin as a game. It certainly originated as a game. I don't think there's any evidence that's come to light showing that, in fact, it had a mystical origin and then became a game. I think it started as a game, but must have clearly been designed by whoever did the first decks in Florence to contain some other meanings. And the idea of containing meanings in these cards was increasingly popular, as we've seen over time. Not one of the most significant developments in that understanding of the transition of the tarot from a game to divination to occult secrets is my recent is Stav Appel's recent work, showing how this one rendition of the Marseille Tarot got co-opted to hide Jewish education and mysteries and secrets in it, because it was illegal at the time to even be Jewish in many places, and that was a method they used for smuggling in their teachings and culture into a form that could be expressed and taught, and then I imagine that deck would have been passed around by Jews, probably even given to their kids as a teaching tool. But we'll leave that for Stav to continue to reveal to us in his ongoing wonderful research on that very unique deck. But what it highlights historically, of course, is this touch point, this key point in an evident transition from the cards as a game sort of light divination tool that you could take seriously or not, in a similar kind of parallel way to how people take Ouija boards. Most people just are messing about and think it's just a joke. Some people, of course, are superstitious about it, but very few people actually use it as their main method to contact spirits, even though by all accounts it can be as effective as anything else, provided the people know how to conjure and work with spirits in the first place. Of course, that's the real trick. So he says an Arcanum is that which is necessary to know in order to be fruitful in a given domain of spiritual life. It is that which must be actively present in our consciousness or even in our subconscious in order to render us capable of making discoveries, engendering new ideas, conceiving new artistic subjects. In a word, he says it makes us fertile in our creative pursuits in whatever domain of spiritual life. So these are mysteries that connect us to stuff we don't know, but can find out about ourselves through the contemplation practice that most use when working with tarot in this way. So an Arcanum, he says, is a ferment or an enzyme. It's interesting that he uses those terms. I think it shows a lot about the attempts within the 20th century to connect spirituality and science in a way that it hadn't been since its divorce, acrimonious or otherwise divorce during the Enlightenment, whose presence stimulates the spiritual and the psychic life of humanity. He says man, but he meant humanity. Of course, literally, that is what he meant. So he talks a lot about authentic symbols, like what is an authentic symbol? And that's what he considers the Arcana to be. He says the major arcana of the tarot are authentic symbols. They conceal and reveal their sense at one and the same time, according to the depth of meditation. And right away, I love the fact that he's putting the onus on the practitioner. Now, this is something that either it slipped by all of his all the praise he got from all the many Catholic notable spiritual leaders in the back of the book, as well as the Pope, who had a 2-volume hardcover set famously photographed on his desk before he died. Well, the photograph was actually from a while ago, but get the idea. So I'm not sure how much they noticed this emphasis on practices that would be hard to define as anything but magical. But they might have also just been noticing it and letting it slide and thinking, hey, we can get this back into our tradition a little bit, into the mystical core of Roman Catholicism, which had definitely been struggling for a long time, since really the Jesuits and the Counter-Reformation. They had to dissuade the public that they were heretical, and therefore changed a lot of their mystical practices and stamped many of them out as well, of course, because they were either similar to magic or borderline actual magic. The famous case of the indulgences and the lines of going for miles for people just to touch the bone of some saint so they could get their grandma 10 years off in purgatory. I mean, it was a racket. There's no doubt about that. So authentic symbols for Tomberg is a specific thing. They are magic, mental, psychic, and moral operations. He says, awakening new notions, ideas, sentiments, and aspirations, which means to say that they require an activity more profound than that of study and intellectual explanation. So he does spell it out. He mentions what the phrase authentic symbol twice in the chapter, and both times he takes the reader to an understanding that you can't just think about this stuff. You can't just contemplate it in a hypothetical way. You have to do something. The doing of the things, like a lot of people, when you recommend this book to them, they are often dismayed because there's no rituals in it, no step-by-steps, no secrets to conjuration, no here's the real circle that you should summon them into, nothing like that. And they wonder why. Well, let's not forget what he's trying to do here. He's trying to make this stuff accessible to an audience that normally wouldn't read it. I mean, yeah, coming out of Martinism and anthroposophy and the Steiner stuff, it would have been very hard for Tomberg to get this accepted in any Catholic context if he had, of course, blatant discussion of ritual practice, for the most part. So Tomberg talks about the arcana of the tarot as authentic symbols, concealing and revealing, describing what would be a reflexive action that is obviously echoed in the Emerald Tablet text, which he discusses as a addendum to the final chapter. I used to, when I lecture on this chapter and this card, in the past, I've often to non-practitioner audiences focused on Tomberg's extensive analysis of justifying certain key elements of his arguments. For example, hierarchies, as well as the reality that the world below is created by the world above and vice versa. And he goes into arguments of analogia ensis, the method of analogy, to clarify that. But for practitioners, I think what's more interesting is to focus for us on the key point of the chapter, which is the tool or exercise that he's trying to get at. Like, he describes all of these chapters as letters, as series of exercises. So each letter has an exercise embedded in it, and extracting that is really one of the fun parts about going through the book. You get this wonderful demonstration of a master who's has broadly read in the philosophy of his day and of ancient times, is very familiar with the varieties of different religious and theological approaches to magic and mysticism, but yet he incorporates things like the Emerald Tablet, which we now know is not even a Hermetic text. It's just one of the many texts that we have that is attributed to Hermes, and hopefully we'll find new sources of that text, because currently the oldest one is Arabic one. We found one that he didn't have since the time he wrote his book, or we understand it better and where it came from, but we have no evidence that it was actually part of the Hermetic literature and the Hermetic communities that produced the Corpus Hermeticum and the Technical Hermetica. So really, this is the Emerald Tablet's just a text attributed to Hermes that probably developed more out of an alchemical frame of reference, and as we know, from the Arabic world, which would make sense because they were more into alchemy than they were into Hermetism and the practices of Alexandrian Hermetists, which was quite different than alchemy as it was understood then and now. Well, arguably so now, since we have quite a new understanding of alchemy that was not so prevalent in ancient times, being the spiritual New Age interpretation of alchemy as a form of transformation, of like self-improvement. It is therefore really in a state of deep contemplation, he's saying, that is always getting deeper, that you should be approached. So he can't go into actual practices, though he certainly would have been familiar with them. I mean, we're talking about someone who would have been familiar with Franz Barden's work, the Golden Dawn's work, and all of these things. So he can't say some of those things out loud, but he's trying to get you to realize you need to work with what's actually contained in the cards, with the spirit of the cards, and increasing depths of realizations, which is exactly, is what pathworking is. It is what we do in the process of projecting ourselves into the cards and having an experience of nature and spirit within them. And he's aware of that. He knows about these things, and he would practice these things, especially as a Martinist, though I'm not exactly sure how he would do that as a Martinist, because I don't have a Martinist background. Moving on. And I would like to say, on the note of Martinism, it's of course a very sad week. I was going to get help throughout the next 2 years of doing this study with my students from my dear friend Paul Rana, Edward Rana, who's a head of the OMS Martinist order and who passed away last Monday. And that's very sad. And he was really the only one who could help me identify key Martinist elements in the text and be like, oh, this is what that's about in the Martinist order. That here's a reference there, and this is what the sort of practices we do there. So it's very tragic that he is gone. It's been a very weepy week. And as for the Martinist elements, they will remain somewhat a mystery to me in this book until I either join Martinism or find some Martinist who knows the text as well as he did, and there's not many of them. I did talk to a bunch to see if any of them had any pointers on elements of Martinism hidden in the first letter of this text, but none of them knew this text or Martinism actually that well. So rest in peace, Edward. Thank you. How do the Arcana work? Well, he breaks it down, and you have to jump around in the book, in the chapter, to find this out. He doesn't lay it out straightforward like a step-by-step, because he doesn't necessarily want to know people who aren't looking for it what he's suggesting. And what he's suggesting isn't revolutionary. It's very common for occultists to know this. Most people who have had any experience with magic books know what's going on here. And the first part is that it's theoria, the Greek word for contemplation, and this is referring to the spiritual grasping of information, more similar, less, of course, with nothing similar, less similar to theoretical pondering, and more closely allied to the idea of cleaving to God, devakut in the Hebrew Kabbalistic traditions or religion, the idea of these cleaving to God and trying to achieve kavanah. Solitude is the other thing he points out, and he a couple times, I think, insinuates that therefore this path is really best for those who, for a recluse. And I think he must be making a little joke there, because it's funny, but it's also true and not true. I mean, obviously you don't need to be a recluse to participate in any of this stuff. Most people aren't. However, if you are a recluse, this is definitely going to make things easier for you. And it's hard to also ignore his comment about seclusion or being reclusive, with the fact that any conjurer or magician knows how much easier it is to get spirits to show up, and how much easier it is to get them to do more and be present more if you're in a cabin in the woods rather than an apartment in a city, or in a building with other people in it, period. It's just better. But he doesn't say that, but I think it's something he would have probably been thinking when he wrote that. It's one of those things, if you know, you know. What do the Arcana do? So what's the purpose of this active contemplation of these cards, of these Arcana? To awaken deeper meaning, to help us realize things that we don't already know. And this is what causes us, he says, to stimulate the spiritual and psychical life. By psychical life, he also very much means a psychological life, because this was, let's not forget, the period in which sort of psychism and psychology were developing. They were trucking along slowly in a strange dance, probably ever since the time of like Anton Mesmer. And then, it's been sort of a mess ever since the vague line between the idea of psychological worlds and psychical worlds, right? They have the collective unconscious, and we talk about the astral plane. Are we really even talking about two different things? But more importantly, do either of those terms describe the thing itself in any slightly satisfying way? I don't think they do. Whatever the out there is that we experience or that we go into, either in practice, or after death, understanding what it really is still beyond us all. Like Sir Roger Penrose, the physicist, I believe he's a physicist, says he doesn't like being called a materialist because we still don't know what the matter is, what it is. And I love that. Don't call me that, because we don't know what it is. He notes quite delightfully to beware the greatest spiritual malady you could possibly encounter, which is self-complacency. And it is interesting. It reminds me of the idea that you shouldn't be lukewarm. Jesus says that in the Bible, right? Be hot or cold, but just don't be lukewarm, because I can't do anything with that. And he talks about charlatanry, how we can become charlatans. And it's an interesting point he makes when talking about how you will know other people who are on the path. And he says you'll know them, you'll know other initiates and true people, true seekers, and by the fact that they will love each other. And I thought about that. That's a very interesting one. And so therefore it seems to follow that the charlatans that he identifies are people who aren't actually capable, who don't love each other. So if you take that and then look at it, project it out there into just the current culture, it's actually quite interesting, because when he talks about how initiation works, and like there's the little initiations we do for each other as human beings, at passing things on as hierophants, or as Wiccan leaders or coven leaders or grove leaders, whatever your faith or tradition is. There's so many that are lively and active today. There's just infinite paths of initiation. But in the terms of the great initiation, with the great initiator, which is God, and that splendid apotheosis that we're all striving towards, of full realization or knowledge and conversation, or in the old Neoplatonic sense of the communication with the daimon that has a soteriological salvific effect of saving you from the bonds of the matter. And then the Gnostics like this idea too, because they want to free from matter and connect with the holy daemon, and that frees them because they now have knowledge. If they have full knowledge, then they become truly sacred and saint-like, and all the other Gnostics would give them pride of place and see themselves as less saved than them. This is one of those interesting ideas within Gnosticism that the Hermetists utterly rejected. The smaller community of Hermetists rejected that in favor of the idea that even the body and the world is part of the same light, the same nous of God, and therefore connection with that light or the holy daemon or the nous isn't about freeing ourselves from this matter and this dross. It's about enlivening it with and uniting it and being fully a part of God in the body, in the world. And so that true kind of initiation is expressed amongst each other with love, quite simply. And you do see this in the world, like even amongst the people I meet from other orders or ex-members of orders, or there's those people I talk to who from the get-go see us all as all part of that same light, that same invisible college, right? They might be a Thelemite, and I'm certainly not, but hey, we're still part of that same invisible college, right? The true college. We're still like gonna love each other and treat each other well, which is just, of course, basic Judeo-Christian ethos of love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But in occultism, we take that into the realm of, we might not be in the same orders, we might have different views as each other, we might have very different magical paths that we're on, but we could still choose to love each other and treat each other with love and respect. And therefore, we are participating in a form of that great initiation, which is, being true believers in God. Whereas charlatanry would, I guess, lack that love. It would lack the love of the other, because you wouldn't have the love in yourself. You wouldn't have the true initiation going on yourself, because you're replacing the idea of the great initiation, of the true initiation with God, by aggrandizing human initiation or human accomplishments or achievements, and seeing them as being in some way equivalent or better than or as good as a pure and loving relationship with the divine, and therefore each other. So let's look at this from another point of view. Because he says there's the secrets, which are just things we know, like a technique I show you, or how to draw the pentagrams right, or what time of the day to summon a spirit. There's the secrets, things you can just know, but those are lesser than the Arcanum. The Arcanum is something that is like a path that takes you somewhere and also brings things to you. It is this reflexive action, this to and fro between the spirit and between us. But beyond even the Arcanum, even greater than the Arcanum, he says, is the mystery. Now, what is the mystery for Tomberg? I thought an iceberg image would do the trick, because that is the idea, right? The secret is just knowing that there's an iceberg. The secret's just cognitive information. There's an iceberg there. Maybe you know what an iceberg is maybe you don't. But the Arcanum is then the actual surface of it, which leads you to the mystery. But the mystery is below the depths. You can't actually go down there. It's the majority of what you're talking about. And though you can see some reflection or get some idea of the form and size and substance that it's made of, or what that substance is like, the cold ice from the top, you'll never really know how that plays out down below, because that's something that, well, either you have to submerge yourself in deep contemplation and therefore access the great initiation, which he's speaking of, or pass on from this world and find out that way. There seems to be those two things. The mystery, he says, is discovered through knowledge, in particularly knowledge of the Arcanum. We move from passive knowing of the secret then to active engagement, or theoria, with the Arcanum, ideally in the hopes to gain some intimation of the mystery, or the mysterion, in the idea of the sort of the Greek noun is a really good word to illustrate the reality of the mystery, or the mystery as experience. So Tomberg notes that the mystery is different in that the mystery is not an action and it's not knowledge. It's not what you know, it's not something you do, but it's an event. So in that sense, it's greater than us. And so ultimately what we see is a triple action, from passive knowing to active contemplation / participation to the event of the mystery, the mysterion. And yeah, here I displayed that for you again, seeing it in a slightly different way. Sometimes these models of looking at information can help us out. The major arcana of the tarot are neither allegories nor secrets, he says, because allegories are in fact only figurative representations of abstract notions, and secrets are only facts, procedures, practices, like I already said, or whatever doctrines you keep to yourself for personal motive, since they are able to be understood and put into practice by others to whom one does not want to reveal them. Now, the major arcana of the tarot are authentic symbols, as he said before. They conceal and reveal their sense at one and the same time, according to the depth of meditation. So what you experience is deeper the further you go. That which they reveal are not secrets. And this is, again, you're probably instantly thinking of the many problems caused within the occulture, shall we say, by the confusion of this point. The idea that the mysteries that are revealed to a person are somehow secrets, like that what a spirit tells you are powerful secrets that if ever other people knew them would have access to the same mystery, but they won't, because they didn't have the experience. So the information you might get from a spirit or from an initiatory event or a ritual you just did, nothing you learn from that is actually a secret. It's a mystery. So it's useful for you because you had the experience, which is the mystery. But the information itself is not this secret power that you can give to someone else or sell to someone else so that they can then have the same experience as you. They have to go about it their own way. There's just nothing more to that. I mean, we build human attempts to convey mysteries that we pass down in human life. We see that in the magical orders and in the different magical traditions. We see that in the religions. But we all know that converting to a religion and going to church or joining an order or, becoming a third degree witch, none of these things in and of themselves is actually going to change you necessarily. That's the problem. And also the gift, because it comes from somewhere else. That's what he keeps wanting to get at. It does come from somewhere else. So in a way, as much as he's Roman Catholic in this book is apologetical in many ways, he's constantly not apologizing, sort of sorry, not sorry type of approach to both his faith in Jesus Christ as a new Roman Catholic, but also his commitment to his understanding of the mysteries as an occultist and practitioner. He's saying you need to go do these things, and even though I may be Catholic right now, that's still just part of it. That's not the whole thing. He's not getting lost in thinking that the Catholic Church is the be all and end all for all people in all time. he does imply sort of that at certain points within the book, but then he also contradicts it when he comes out and says things like this, and points to the true depths of what the real mystery is, which is that it must, of course, transcend an earthly church, which means, of course, that he rejects some of the dogmas of the Roman Catholic Church. He just does so quietly and with a very mystical kind of smile. So they are not arcana, which is something quite different. An arcanum is that which it is necessary to know. First, you have to know it in order to be fruitful in a given domain of spiritual life. It is that which we must be actively present in our consciousness, which of course is why we do things like the tarot contemplation rituals in the Golden Dawn, and in many traditions, actually, I think these days, are using it to embed those images within our psyche so that we can call them to mind at will and work with them without having a card present, or a tool, a medium, unmediated, right? Pure cataphatic mystical experience without the bells and whistles. It is that which must be actively present in our consciousness or even in our subconscious in order to render us capable of making discoveries, engendering new ideas, conceiving of new artistic subjects. In a word, it makes us fertile in our creative pursuits in whatever domain of spiritual life. So another way of saying that is, in other words, the arcana initiate us into the mystery, and that mystery is the great initiation. Moving on, what is the mystery? He says, just as the arcanum is superior to the secret, so is the mystery superior to the arcanum. The mystery is more than a stimulating ferment. It is a spiritual event comparable to physical birth or death. So that is a significant point, really, right there, that is worth remembering for everyone who loves to claim they've scaled the heights of creation and are an enlightened guru. Maybe. It is a change of the entire spiritual and psychic motivation, or a complete change of the plane of consciousness. So the fact that it's an event means it's not something that another person can put you through. No one else can initiate you into what he calls the great initiation and the great mystery, really. And the fact that he compares it to birth or death, it's very hard to then think that it's something that you take with you in your everyday life. You know, birth and death are both such distinct and definite stages that with such a strong physical and physiological, biological element to them. I think the idea of the great mystery, in some ways, is something he means happens at death, or with the death, at least, of who you are today. So when this could be seen in a simple and trite form, like, when you convert to God, like you could interpret this as, if you converted to Roman Catholicism and died to your own life, you're reborn to your true faith now in Jesus, and that would be a very simple, superficial way to interpret what he's saying. But I think, obviously, what he's getting at is also the deeper implication that we see readily demonstrated in everything from the initiatory traditions of Martinism, the Golden Dawn, and Thelema traditions, and all the new ones emulate this as well, especially the pagan traditions that celebrate the life, death, and rebirths cycle. Yeah, it's almost lost my train of thought there. It's the idea that shit, I did. Sorry there. Gears are spinning. Yeah, so the transformation is represented by the traditions around us, but again, it's something that needs to be that isn't replicatable, even though we emulate it in human initiations. It's preparing us for one that we can't really create, though we try with those traditions I already mentioned, and also with things like the Abramelin, which is again a very modern by comparison, representation of the Neoplatonic and Gnostic idea of contacting the holy daemon to get that first glimmer of what true reality is, so that you're freed and liberated from the feeling of confinement and finitude of this lifetime. Right, that's what that great initiation would have been for them, is that glimmer of light, knowing that there is a hereafter. Though of course these days, a lot of people just do a little DMT, and that seems to convince them that there's a hereafter. And of course, I'm there's lots of people have their opinions on my my openness to psychedelia and the fact that I don't discount it out of hand. But I would say that, while I'm not convinced it's proof of spirit or any of that, or of a spiritual reality, I don't think DMT proves that at all. It's definitely invites us to ask different questions about reality, and maybe even investigate it further if you have the metabolism to do so and the live in the right place with the right people. I don't know if they're experimenting, the experts are doing that. I'll leave it to them. I've sort of gone as far as I can go with that stuff. There's only so much time in life, right? So we all have some idea of what Tomberg means when he discusses the mystery. It's an event, and while we may have traveled far for the event, it's going to happen all the same. There's this idea that you can't escape it. So this is what he calls the great initiation, and from the ways Tomberg also discusses it, we can tell that while it is similar to birth or death, it is something else that he's referring to. He's not actually just saying it's birth or death, though it is tempting to interpret it that way. He is saying it's transformation. He's always saying it's transformation in every case. So that's interesting. And this is what I wrote my main academic book in life about, was this exact idea and issue of mystical dialogue that is transformative versus non-transformative, as being a gauge for understanding sort of the ethical locality where we find ourselves and how we make decisions after that's occurred. I was very interested in what all my life and what it means when someone's like, I prayed to God and they said I should drop a bomb on that country. Obviously, I was in seminary during the Bush era, so it's always on my brain when I think of that stuff. And I was very curious what that meant theologically and ethically when people take instructions to do horrible things from prayer, just from prayer. It's kind of it's a question that's well worth constant study, I think. So, but back to the point. Some prayer and some mystical dialogue, some communications with the divine transform us, and some don't. And it's the ones that transform us that I find most interesting, though the ones that don't transform us, I think, do tend to lead to what you could call charlatanry or just, it's just, shall we just call bullshit, right? God said I should take your stuff because he wants me to have it. That's what someone literally told me once. God came to me, said, you're done and your stuff's mine now. And then they took my stuff. But that's history, all in the past. But that is interesting that people do that, right? They communicate with God and nothing changes in their life. They just go and do something awful. But it's because they had no transformation, because there was no initiation. There was no dialogue, not authentically, not with spirit, right? And that's the indicator that I look for, and did it when I was doing my study in grad school. The indicator I looked for was ethics, was how do we behave? So what if I say I talk to God? Say, what if God told me, or some spirit told me this or that, if then my behaviors and my actions therefrom are abominable? So transformation, which results in spiritual change, psychic change, and consciousness change, whether those are one thing or different things, is always worth discussing. We just don't have time here, but I'll leave you guys to contemplate that for yourself. For Tomberg, this great mystery and great initiation is, said lightly, apotheosis, or the realization that all is one. If we all like this familiar language, as much as it's fun to make fun of some of the flakier ideas in spirituality, oftentimes they're still very true. the ideas themselves are not actually bad. It's just they get co-opted by sometimes very vapid approaches. So if you like that familiar language, of course, as a Roman Catholic convert, we cannot pretend for Tomberg that this did not also mean faith in Christ and the belief that we are all one in Christ. That's certainly there as well. Tomberg makes neither any apology for his Christian Catholicism in Meditations on the Tarot, but he also doesn't hide his esoteric heterodoxy and mysticism, and even, as I've pointed out a few places, magical practice, where we can see indicators of that, and we'll see a few more as we move along here. Yeah, I won't keep you guys too long tonight. I'm really great to all have you here. In fact, so we see this throughout his urge to actually practice, and Tomberg calls the magician the Arcanum of the Arcana. One sec. So the first Arcana is the most important. First Arcanum is the most important. And therefore it's the Arcanum of the Arcana. It's the key to understanding all the rest. He says the first Arcanum, the principle underlying all of the other 21 major Arcana of the Tarot, is that of the rapport of personal effort and of spiritual reality. So this is that reflexive action of going forth and coming back, or going up and going down, this back and forth fusion of horizons is what Hans-Georg Gadamer would call it, as just a basic hermeneutical process of understanding. This is joining, which is a back and forth. It occupies the first place in the series because if one does not understand it, i.e. take hold of it in cognitive, and here we go again, actual practice, just slips it in there, one would not know what to do with all the other arcana. For it is the magician who is called to reveal the practical method relating to all the arcana. He is the Arcanum of the Arcana, which is, of course, a fabulous title. For all that Tomberg eschews the pretensions and egoism of so commonly found in occultism, he still gets to use these beautiful terms like Arcanum of the Arcana, which we all, of course, love because they are beautiful, and there's a lot to be said about the value of beauty. Did anyone else notice? Well, I guess I pointed out the actual practice line where he exhorts us to take hold of the first Arcanum in cognitive and actual practice. It's I think there's just no, if he wasn't a Martinist, if he hadn't studied with rules, even if he had studied anthroposophy with Steiner's wife but wasn't a Martinist, if he wasn't a Martinist, we could argue that he wasn't talking about ritual work or evocation and conjuration. But given that he was a Martinist, I'm certain that's what he's talking about, because he would have learned those things. Unfortunately, I can't ask my friend Ed, but hopefully he'll answer in spirit one of these days, or I'll find some other Martinists to talk to. I know a few others, but they're not necessarily experts on this book. Very few people have spent 20 years studying this book, like he and I have. Surely the Cardinal Hans Urs von Balthasar and Pope John Paul II are not endorsing occult practices, right? When they're endorsing this book. And any and every form of magic, we must remember, to this day is considered heresy and evil by the Roman Catholic Church. So again, he got this in, he was writing this and put this out in a time when it was not long after Vatican II, I believe. So it was a more liberal time in some ways for the Roman Catholic Church. They fluctuate, as we know. Not officially, they don't officially fluctuate, but in reality, they do fluctuate back and forth quite a lot. I think the new one's doing all kinds of changes. So lucky for us, Tomberg continues to make no apologies. However, he constantly gives explanations and other apologia as he guides us through these 22 keys. And the key for the magician, the key for the first Arcanum, is concentration without effort, or transforming work into play, and to make every burden that you have light and easy. So That's it. But that's not some small order at all. That's quite high, a tall order. And it's not just one key. It's some sort of a multi-pronged key that we see. How do you find, how do you learn concentration without effort? How do you transform work into play? How do you do these things? Well, here, most of you are probably practicing magicians for some amount of time and have a very good idea of what he would be recommending here. Most traditions have exercises that focus on each of these. He talks in this chapter about the way yoga would incorporate and work this out in practical terms of everyday practice. And in the Golden Dawn tradition I come out of, it's very evident what practices go along with this. You can read Franz Barden and see the same ideas are at work there with the preliminary mental magic and meditation exercises in the Golden Dawn, with the meditation one, the focusing on a single point. And transforming, well, I'll say, he says, let me read this quote. He says, "This counsel or command or even warning, however you wish to take it, is most serious. This is attested by its original source, namely the words of the Master himself, 'My yoke is easy and my burden is light,'" from Matthew 11, verse 30. Now, I do think that is a beautiful interpretation of this biblical pericope, or maybe it's just a quote. It doesn't qualify as a pericope, but the idea that we do need to make the best of our circumstances, of our lives, of the struggles in them, that's certainly a very, very beautiful idea. And the fact that he gives us some idea of how we can do that is very helpful. And certainly, I like to take his advice and then use it to guide me through the magical world. I've been taking his advice to guide me through the world since 2003, when I closed down Temple Tahuti and didn't join a group ever after. And I was like, well, how am I going to do this on my own without any guidance? And I certainly couldn't get guidance from my bishop or classmates in seminary or at university, that's for sure. So I used Tomberg very heavily the last 20 years to guide me, and using his advice to look at different techniques, operations, systems of magic that I was interested in exploring, or people I was interested in working with, and using these criteria to gauge how valuable those experiences or traditions would be, or how developed the person was, enough so that I can understand if I could work with them. Because most people I've worked with independently in my years don't know how to they get yoked down by the slightest burden. They're not very good at just taking on chores and tasks, especially when it comes to even magical work, and doing it with joy and having fun with it. It's almost a chore often for them. And so that's always an indicator of someone maybe you don't want to work with, or point them in the right direction so they can work on themselves a bit more first. But again, these are some good guide stones here. Guide stones is maybe a inappropriate, bad choice of word these days, since it's slightly laid in language. But let's consider this and examine it in the three parts of the formula. In order to penetrate the Arcanum of active relaxation, or effort without effort, firstly, learn at first concentration without effort. And what is this in a practical and theoretical sense? So he says, both St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila do not tire of repeating that concentration is necessary for spiritual prayer and is the fruit of moral purification of the will. This was a very big idea within the mystical movements in Spain at that time. Slight typo in concentration there, eh? Oh well. And they had many different techniques that they practiced. I can't go into that stuff now. That would be a whole thing in and of itself. I will talk about some of it when I record my lecture on St. John of the Cross and the tunnels of Set in Kenneth Grant. I will go into some of St. John of the Cross's techniques when I do that video series, which I'm just going to record on my own and then put out there for folks. But St. Teresa of Avila, if her writings are very good, so you can go to her writings and readily see the spiritual exercises she recommends, and they're very good often for the concentration practices in them. I would start with Interior Castles, just because I personally love that book, though I think you'll find more of her exercises more straight, clearly laid out in other places. So to be silent, he says, is therefore proceeds to know and to will and to dare. And this is why he says the Pythagorean school was had such a strong requirement for 5 years of silence, which is quite famous. We all know that. But what stands out to me about to be silent being the first step, of course, is as a Golden Dawn person, the fact that Harpocrates, the Egyptian god of silence, is the ruler of the neophyte grade, of the first grade, and the sign of silence is one of the core gestures you're given after your initiation into that grade. And of course, the sign of silence has since become almost ubiquitous across occult practitioners who are incorporating it into their ritual work, along with, of course, the sign of Horus. But here, the sign of the idea of beginning with to be silent, whether you have to go and become a recluse in a hermitage, or whether you have to just learn how to develop a detachment from your desires and otherwise dominating passions and cravings that distract you from being able to just detach and enter a simple meditative state. I mean, that is what he's talking about, creating a zone of silence around yourself, as he other times calls it. He says, of the two kinds of concentration, disinterested concentration and the other interested concentration, it is the condition of the will which is the determining and decisive factor in concentration. So that's, for me, one of the most interesting points. So what allows, because we've all tried to meditate and had a hard time concentrating. I mean, that doesn't go away even the more you meditate. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's your mind is distracted by cravings, especially if you're like on day 3 of a fast and trying to meditate, getting ready for a conjuration that night. It can be very rough. And so the fact that he points to will being the factor that actually makes it easier to concentrate. I mean, it's in some ways a no-brainer, but in other ways, it does give us an indication of how we can simply improve our ability to enter into a state of disinterested concentration. And he says the first, which he says about disinterested concentration, the first is due to the will free of enslaving passions, obsessions, and attachments, whereas the other is the result of a dominating passion, obsession, or attachment. So it always makes me think, actually, of this when I briefly, in between college semesters, had a job at a white spot for 3 months, and I was spilling glasses of fluid a lot because I hadn't done this sort of thing before, rushing around in a busy environment carrying glasses, until a girl pointed out to me that if I didn't look at the cup I was carrying or the things on the tray, if I didn't look at them but looked at where I was going to put them down on the table, I wouldn't spill them. And sure enough, I stopped spilling. Like it all fit together. I was no longer focused and distracted by what was immediately, demanding my attention, which is what I was carrying, and I focused elsewhere. I was disinterested in what's here and just interested in what's out there, where I was going, the destination. And yeah, magically your body adapts and just doesn't spill things as well. I don't know if any of you have noticed that in life, but it's true. So maybe you've if you spill your glasses of water often, you could take up that practice and see for yourself. It's a little freaky. It's one of those freaky things. You try it with a full glass that you're likely to spill and just look at where you're going. Boom. So there's my little anecdote. I always love it when our body does things that we better without our sort of attempts to control it. There's a few things our body does better without our interference. Thank God. All right, concentration without effort. This is one of the key phrases throughout this chapter and the first letter. of this Arcanum. One may say that the entire being becomes like the surface of calm water, reflecting the immense presence of the starry sky and its indescribable harmony. This has always been my experience as being the result of practicing ritual work from an early age. Meditation as well, of course, but ritual in particular, I found really created that sense of calm surface. So after I do all my rituals in my circle and get myself to a state of where it feels like I am so calm and the universe is so calm that any little pebble dropped in it will just ripple out. And in some ways, I think that says something about how magic works to an extent. To another extent, we rely heavily on spirits to do a lot of the heavy lifting, of course, and ideally combining both those things together. So concentration without effort, that is to say, where there is nothing to suppress and where contemplation becomes as natural as breathing and the beating of the heart, is the state of consciousness, thought, imagination, feeling, will, perfect calm, accompanied by the relaxation of the nerves and the muscles of the body. It is the profound silence of desires, of preoccupations, of the imagination, and of the memory and discursive thought. So that's the secret. It's important. It's very hard to be effective in magic without that ability. One of the David Rankin mentioned recently on the glitch bottle on his episode, where it's so important to be able to not think and to know how your mind works. And a lot of us forget that, because he mentioned that if the more you can control that, the easier it is to allow for spirits to communicate and for perceptions to be accurate that are received. There's the other school of thought, of course, that is just like, if the spirit's actually there, they'll talk over my own thoughts and I'll hear them distinctly enough. I think my opinion is that has to do with the degree to which the spirit shows up in the conjuration. That's my opinion. Some people think it's like an either worked or it didn't. I think there's more gradations than that, but partly that's due to the fact that I'm not strictly into Solomonic magic over crystal scrying, which many people are. A lot of people do one or the other. But if you do both, the flexibility of to what extent the spirit's there, especially if you are engaged much in astral work and astral travel, where you're going to the realm where the spirit is to communicate. Yes, but these are the debates of modern occultists. Hey, did we get that? So nextly, transforming work into play. We're almost done here, and then we'll do a little Q&A chit chat before we have to go. Thanks for being here on this wonderful Sunday afternoon, evening. The changing of work, which is duty, into play is affected as a consequence of the presence of the zone of perpetual silence, where one draws from a sort of secret and intimate respiration, whose sweetness and freshness accomplishes the anointing of work and transforms it into play. Now, I think that's very beautifully said, and the idea of a zone of perpetual silence might be a little bit terrifying if it's not understood in a spiritual sense. But in a spiritual sense, of course, we want none of that chatter, none of that, I'm not good enough, I'm on the wrong path, none of this matters. What's the point in doing prayers or ritual work anyway? We're all going to die, who cares? Those sort of things, you don't want them. You're much better to have a zone of silence. And the zone of silence can occur by accessing the mystery through the Arcanum. And the Arcanum leads us into that mystery, and that mystery gives to us a sense of the great initiation of the true light of life in the universe, which gives us peace and helps us have our will focused on what we're really here to do in our life. What's your mission? What's your true will? That true will is a useful and popular phrase, despite its weaknesses and despite the problems that come along with the idea of having a true will. There's some issues with that term. There's issues with all those terms: higher genius, higher self, holy guardian angel, holy daemon. They each have their baggage, right? But the idea that once you are tapped into that true initiatory current of light, that you have this sense of the rest of the world being muffled around you, right? Like just doesn't bother you as much because you know what you need to do. You're not going to stop doing what you need to do. You only have this one life so far to do it and to live it. So move forward. And that's what then also turns a lot of work into play, because you realize that you're doing what you need to be doing. You don't need to stress about it because you have no choice. Part of it's you've let die the lower self and let the divine self or your God or Jesus or whatever it is for you take over, or come into participation reflexively with the great mystery, so that you're doing your best thing in life, the most important thing in life. And a lot of then everything does become play. I've never worked a day in my life. Well, maybe at White Spot. But yes, there's the idea. I've taken this idea to heart for a long time, as maybe you can tell, since I encountered it in when we were required to read this book in Portal. And thank God for that idea, because life's been pretty fucking awful at times, and it's been very nice to have these as guiding, saving sort of guideposts for me along the way. It's certainly saved my life, these kinds of ideas and these practices, many times over. In other words, if one wants to practice some form of authentic esotericism, be it mysticism, gnosis, or magic, it is necessary to be the magician, Tomberg says. He says, i.e. concentration without effort, operating with ease as if one were playing and acting with perfect calm. This then is the practical teaching of the first Arcanum of the tarot. Just take another sip of water and get through these last 3 slides. So, truth for Tomberg is both nature and spirit, but his unity, while rejecting plurality, like a good Roman Catholic has to, sort of, includes pluralism still within an inclusivist kind of metaphysic. He doesn't think there's multiple realities out there necessarily, or multiple gods, like pluralism would assert. I tend to be more on the pluralist side myself, but I would fit within his schema, because he just includes pluralism within his idea of the organism, the metaphysical idea of the organism, which is my view on metaphysics, is nature and spirit as the only pre-categories to reality, and everything else after that is sort of emerges out of them, including us and all biological physical reality as well. So he says, we declare that the world is not a mosaic where a plurality of worlds which are essentially strangers to one another are fitted together, but that it is an organism, all of whose parts are governed by the same principle, revealing it and allowing reduction to it. So the idea, this is the inclusivist theology. There's the exclusivist view that this is the only way, or one view is the only view. Then there's the inclusivist view, which is that they all sort of work, but because they secretly go through us. And this is the organism idea. And that is his edgy theological take for being at present a Roman Catholic when he wrote this, and through the end of his life. So he was limited in how he could see things, but he tries to really fit it in here, and he does, I think, with the idea of the model of the organism, appropriating the conception of different paths, different religions, different faiths, and people all on the planet, but they're all still part of life, right? So it's all the one life, and that's all that's true. Now, we can disagree on what that means, and that's where religions and denominations come in. The magician, which is in turn the key to all the other major arcana. This is why I have put them as an epigraph to this letter. And then I've cited a verse from the Songs of the Soul of St. John of the Cross, because it has the virtue of awakening the deeper layers of the soul, which one has to appeal to when the concern is the first arcanum of the tarot, and consequently all major arcana of the tarot. For he says again, they are authentic symbols. They are magic, mental, psychic, and moral operations, awakening new notions, ideas, sentiments, and aspirations, which means to say that they require an activity more profound than that of study and intellectual explanation. It is therefore in a state of deep contemplation, always deeper and ever deeper, that they should be approached. And it is the deep and intimate layers of the soul which become active and bear fruit when one meditates on the arcana of the tarot. Therefore, this night of which St. John of the Cross speaks is necessary, where one withdraws oneself in secret and into which one has to immerse oneself each time that one meditates on the arcana of the tarot. It is a work to be accomplished in solitude. He says, it goes without saying that nobody initiates anyone else. If we understand by initiation the great mystery of the second birth or the great sacrament, this initiation is operative from the above and has the value and the duration of eternity. See, now it's back to sort of sounding like he might be referring to the great initiation as death. You know, he plays a bit with that because maybe it really is, but maybe you can still at least get a taste of what the hereafter is like while you're alive, and therefore that's the great initiation. It would be very easy just to say it's like adepthood or mastery or tiferet or some of these other terms that we like to use to mark ourselves, or like the holy Abramelin operation. We need these terms to mark ourselves as somehow having gotten to some stage that has value and therefore have some titles. But again, it's really powerful to remember the truth behind it all, which is that doesn't matter. And what matters is that through all whatever initiations you have in life, including the ones you get from working with the Arcanum, each of the Arcana themselves, is just these glimmers of the beyond, of the divine purpose for ourselves here. Because it's not just our glimmers of that, it's that glimmer of us. It's the glimmering of both parts where God sees us and we see God, right? The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me, as I forget who said that. So the initiator is above, and here below one meets only fellow pupils, and they recognize each other by the fact that they love one another, which is from Gospel of John. So we know who's really legit because we love each other. We treat each other with love. You can find out who's not legit if they don't treat you with love. It's very simple. Great rule of thumb for navigating the occult world. I definitely would recommend living by that one. If someone doesn't treat you with love, fuck them. There are no longer any more masters because there is only one soul master who is the initiator above. To be sure, there are always masters who teach their doctrines and also initiates who communicate some of the secrets which they possess to others, who thus become, in their turn, the initiates. But all this has nothing to do with the mystery of the great initiation. We'll quickly break that down to 3 points to leave you with. It goes without saying that nobody initiates anyone else. The initiator is above, and here below, we only meet fellow pupils. So, quite simply, as a rule of thumb, don't worry about initiation even, I would say. That's what I tell people. There's lots of ways to do it. Every time you do anything, you are in fact enacting an initiatory procedure. It doesn't necessarily have to be a magical one, right? Masonic initiations aren't considered technically magical because you're not summoning any spirits and telling them to do things to the candidate. That would make it a magical initiation. That's exactly what we do in Golden Dawn initiations, and I presume also in the Lemic ones and other traditions as well, though I can't speak to what I haven't done. So initiation, to one extent, I mean, it's great that we participate in emulating the great divine initiation in the communication and dialogues and sharing of mysteries with each other in community. But the most important feature there is loving one another. It's more important to love each other, to love other people, than it is to be part of the same group or, taking the same vow, be in the same club. That's the sign of true initiates, that they love other people, not that they know the password. Point 2 to leave you with. To be sure, there are always masters who teach their doctrines. I sort of addressed that already. Yeah, so there are still things worth sharing. It's worth sharing these mysteries, and all of these things are of value because they do emulate the great divine initiation, but also because they help teach us and we help learn and form communities. And those things are all very healthy things. Tomberg, as much as he praises the idea of maybe being a recluse or things being easier if you're a recluse, at the same time, it's all, community is very important, especially in Christianity. That's a key feature. The idea of a personal solo relationship with Jesus Christ is a very modern idea, a very evangelical modern idea. It did not exist in Jesus's time and in the early church at all. It was always a communal relationship with God and Christ, never a personal one. Point 3 to leave you with: there are no longer any more masters because there's only one master, the initiator above. But all this has nothing to do with the great initiation. Okay, I think I did comment on that already. So yeah, I touched on those. I didn't think I need to elucidate that any further. Well, I hope you enjoy Tomberg's comment about this work being more suitable to recluses, since a lot of us are still limited in our abilities to travel, if not due to lockdowns, like me. We still can't travel to the States, but that will change soon, hopefully. A lot of us have had our lives grow smaller. People have died and families have disconnected, and a lot of us are more isolated more now than ever. So I hope you like the little bit of the upside to that being in Tomberg's opinion, that this is very suitable work for you if you're increasingly reclusive. No, I'm a little tongue-tied today, aren't I? It's one of those things I think he was definitely joking about, but again, it's not a bad thing if you're engaged in spiritual work, especially conjuration and all of that fun stuff. So keep in mind that for all of his Catholicism, he still was deeply influenced by yoga, anthroposophy, magical practices, Gnosticism, and all of that. And I'm going to leave you with this last quote. This is what he recommends you memorize and say every day. This is what he thinks every magician should say every day. I don't think it's necessary to say this exact thing every day, though. Some pretty good advice. To perceive and to know, to try and to be able to are all different things. There are mirages above as there are mirages below. You only know that which is verified by the agreement of all forms of experience in its totality. Experience of the senses, moral experience, psychic experience, the collective experience of other seekers for the truth, and finally the experience of those whose knowing merits the title of wisdom, and those whose striving has been crowned by the title of saint. There's another section after that where he talks about relying on and trusting the academics and the officials of the church. These days, I don't think he would say that anymore, so I cut that out. He might still say that, but I think we shouldn't trust blindly either the churches or the academics anymore, if we ever did. Carry them out strictly before and after each flight into the region beyond the domain of work and effort. If you do this, you will be a sage and a mage. If you do not do this, you will be only a charlatan. You gotta love it. He goes out with a bit of a flair. Definitely a man of desire, as the Martinists are called. They're called men of desire. And I think that is sort of lovely, especially coming, as I do, from a more ascetic self-rejection tradition of a desire being a bad thing. That's sort of my background more. I love the idea that they highlight passion as a virtue. I think that's lovely and not necessarily a bad thing. But of course, to each their own. All right, thank you for attending, and let's do a little, I'm going to stop the recording and we can do a little Q&A and discussion. All right.